G'day, you mob. How's it going? Welcome to this episode of Aussie English. I hope you guys are having an absolutely bloody fantastic week. I'm doing pretty well, chugging along. It's been a good week so far. Although the kids are a little under the weather. They have been sick, coughing a lot. It's one of those, I think it's probably one of those daycare diseases that is doing the rounds. And so I'm sort of sitting at home with bated breath, right? Holding my breath, waiting to get sick myself, because that seems to always happen a day or two after the kids are sick. So fingers crossed. Hopefully I can dodge a bullet and not get sick. It's one of those things that every single winter, it's like you descend into the depths of an Australian winter. And around April, end of April, start of May, that's when everyone starts getting the flu, starts getting sick. And I remember it probably was, what would it have been? It would have been like 2022, I think, the year after. Was that the year COVID ended or the year after it ended? But that first kind of winter after COVID had finished up and everyone was going back to work, kids were going back to school, all that sort of stuff. That was just hell on earth for illnesses. Everyone I knew was getting sick every few weeks. I was getting sick every few weeks. It was also the period where my daughter was really young, going to daycare in the baby room, right? So she would have been about a year old, maybe 18 months old. And that period in particular, where they're not washing their hands a lot, they're licking things, having the nappies changed, touching everything. They seem to just bring home gastroenteritis, right? It's a virus that affects your stomach and your intestines, and it gives you diarrhea and vomiting and all that sort of stuff. I got that thing. I think I had that 6 times in the first 2 or 3 years of my daughter's life, and it was just awful, truly awful. Anyway, I'll stop having a whinge, but yeah, I'm really hoping that this winter isn't too bad. I know I'll get sick probably once or twice, but hopefully it's one of those short-term things that you can kind of, deal with a stuffy head and a bit of a cough for a few days and then you get over it, as opposed to, being in bed for a week or so. All right, let's get into the questions. So as always, guys, don't forget, if you want to ask me questions on Mondays, I try and add a story on my Instagram. You can just search Aussie English _____, and you'll find me on Instagram. Just search Aussie English. And I put up a story with the Ask Me Anything little box. Make sure that you put the question in the box. Some people have sent me questions in messages. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but if you do it in the box, one, I can answer it in a story, because the question comes up and I can hit respond or answer, and then I can make a story with it. And two, I have them all in one place when that happens. I don't have to try and remember who asked me what and where it is, and go through my messages to try and find it. So yeah, if you guys want to ask me a question, if you've got questions about English, Australia, me personally, whatever you want, language learning, feel free to ask in the little story Ask Me Anything box on Mondays on Instagram. Okay, this one comes from Savvje, Savvje. And they ask, what's your favourite music? Now, that's a good question. That is a good question, because it's changed. It's changed quite a bit over the years. When I was a young kid, I think when I was a teenager, right? Before that, it would have just been pop music. The music that your folks, your friends, all the adults in your life kind of expose you to. You hear on the radio. So it's going to be those old tunes. It's going to be pop tunes. It's just generic music is sort of what you listen to and what you like. And then when you become a teenager, you start, I think, exploring musical landscape, right? So the landscape that is all different music. You listen to heavy metal, to rap, to R&B, country music, folk music, pop music, classical music. You generally try and sort of have a listen to everything, I imagine, or at least this is what I did. And then you kind of gravitate towards one thing or another. It's probably going to be related to what your peers are into, I think most people end up listening to music that their friends show them, and they're going to want to get into the kind of music their friends like so that they have that in common, right? So, yeah, when I was a young kid, I was definitely at high school. I think I was into sort of rock and soft rock, acoustic rock, and folk music. I got pretty heavily into that. There were some bands like Carbon Leaf was a really good band that I loved. Josh Pike, those types of bands. Something for Kate, that's another one. Great Big Sea. I'm trying to think who else off the top of my head did I listen to. Josh Pike and Something for Kate are Australian, so you'll probably like them if you check them out. I imagine they're still, doing the rounds. They're still releasing stuff. There was the Pete Murray sort of side of things as well, and there was another guy. There was another Australian dude who was really famous. He did that. You were amazing. We did amazing things. I was amazing. I can't remember the name of him. I think it was Alex Jones or something. Alex something. That song was going around when I was in high school. So I used to listen to loads of that. And then towards the end of high school, when I was probably about 16, 17, 18 years old, it was definitely before I was 18, a friend of mine, Tristan, introduced me to Tool, A Perfect Circle, and I had another friend, Sam, introduced me to Carnival. That's an Australian band. So this is sort of heavier rock, progressive rock type music. Carnival, The Butterfly Effect, Dead Letter Circus, and Cog. These were all Australian bands that were just absolutely brilliant. Birds of Tokyo also shares that singer, Ian Kenny, who is in Carnival. They're both bands from Perth. And yeah, those were all really good bands. I remember they used to tour all the time. You'd see them once or twice a year whilst they were doing the rounds around Australia. Often they would be at festivals. And so, yeah, I got really into the heavier side of rock things, and in particular the progressive side of it. So like A Perfect Circle, Tool, Carnival, Cog, Butterfly Effect. They all had sort of weird time signatures, syncopation, cool rhythms, and different structures to the standard verse, chorus, bridge, chorus type song structure. And I was actually in a band at the time that was writing, and I was the singer. That was the band was a sort of prog rock kind of band as well, and we did quite a few gigs around Melbourne and Geelong, and that was a lot of fun at the time. But yeah, since then though, the older I get, I kind of go through these phases. So it was like in university when I was, the end of high school and university, the start of university, when I was probably between 18 and 22 years old, I listened to music non-stop. I was in the band. We were, sort of doing gigs all over the place. So music was my life. I was singing all the time. I was getting lessons. I was gigging. And I always had something in my ears. I was always listening to music. But I think I sort of gravitated away from that as I started doing postgrad. So I was doing my master's degree and then PhD, and just had less and less time. The band kind of fell apart. I stopped doing the music thing. And so I went out of that kind of phase of just listening to loads of music. And then it's probably, I would listen to bits and pieces here and there every now and then. Two other bands that I really like are Tesseract and Periphery. They're great bands too, in that genre, right? The prog rock, gent, heavy kind of genre. Meshuggah is probably the heaviest of all of them. Meshuggah's great. It's an acquired taste. Or it'll be great. If some of you guys like Meshuggah, let me know, because there's a song from Meshuggah called Bleed, right? Meshuggah, I think if I can spell it, I think it's the Hebrew word for orgasm or something like that. It's something really weird, but Meshuggah is like MESH, Meshuggah, I think UGGA, Meshuggah, AH. It's a weird spelling, but there's a song by them called Bleed, and it has the most insane drums of any song, that I've heard. It's just absolutely insane. It goes, you'll hear it, and it took, apparently the guy wrote it, the drummer wrote this song, he wrote it down. He had the idea in his head and he could think about it and write it down, but he couldn't play it, and it took him apparently like 3 or 4 months of practicing hardcore every single day, trying to nail this drum pattern, this because he does that with his feet on the kicker, the kick drum, right? And the rhythms change all through the song. And apparently it's just really, really hard. I'm not a drummer, but he was saying that it was just insane. But the funny thing was, after that album released with this song Bleed, I think there were videos online of kids learning to play the song and playing it and recording it within a few weeks. And he was just like, what the fuck? He was so like, God damn it. How can these kids just learn this stuff so fast? And Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So I was into all that sort of stuff, and then sort of fell out of love a bit with music. Just didn't really have time. Was busy doing other things, listening to podcasts loads. I went through my phase of listening to loads of, Joe Rogan and other podcasts. This would have been a decade ago when I was, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu bro and going to the gym all the time and always had something in my ears listening to podcasts. But more recently, this is where the story's trying to get me to, I got back into guitar. And so I'm looking at probably about, 15 guitars. I went a bit crazy and bought a bunch of guitars over the last year to try and work out what I like, which instruments I like, and I'm selling a whole bunch now because I've worked out. I'm a massive fan of Telecasters, Strats, and Les Pauls. But yeah, anyway. But since getting back into it, I initially got back into guitar because I was listening to a band called Polyphia. And the music is just insane. Polyphia, I think it's Poly, like Poly, and then Phia. Listen to the song, what is it? Greater Than God. I think it's called like Goat. Greater Than God, or Greatest of All Time, maybe? Yeah, Greatest of All Time. What am I smoking? Greater Than God. Greatest of All Time, so Goat. And it's just brilliant, and it got me wanting to play guitar again. So I went down that rabbit hole and started learning guitar and was trying to get back to, I used to play when I was a little kid or when I was a teenager. I've still got my original guitar that my dad bought me on I think it would have been like my 15th, 16th birthday, sitting in front of me here. Funnily enough, I sort of got back into guitar because I was like, oh man, I'd love to play some of these Polyphia songs one day if I ever get good enough. And in the process of kind of learning scales again, learning how to navigate the fretboard on a guitar and play properly, I've really fallen in love with blues and almost country music to some degree. Like the guitarists who play blues and country music and seem to be able to just improvise, they're the ones who seem to be the most proficient at guitar. There's probably that jazz and funk as well, that genre too, and those guitarists just seem to be really good. But I wanted to just be able to sit down and play on the guitar, make up my own tunes, put together chord progressions, solo over the top, come up with nice licks and riffs and all that sort of stuff. And yeah, it kind of pushed me in a completely different direction. Initially, I thought, I'm going to be playing loads of heavy metal songs, stuff like Tool and Carnival and Periphery and Tesseract, and I play a little bit of them. But really what's kind of scratched the itch for me at the moment is blues music. So I've been listening to a lot of blues and some country music as well for the guitar, and just trying to be as good, get to a level where I can play that kind of music. It's just really motivating. So yeah, at the moment, my favorite sort of music is probably becoming blues rock, that sort of stuff. Anyway, that was a very long answer to a very simple question. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. But let me know what you guys are into music-wise. Do you, now that you're learning English or you speak English at a pretty proficient level, especially if you're listening to me waffle on like this on this podcast, are you listening to a lot of music in English, or do you listen to a lot of music in your own language, you're from your own country or culture? What's it like for you guys? What are the bands that you've fallen in love with, whether they're Australian or English speakers or from, your home country or elsewhere in the world? Let me know. Okay, let's see, let's go. Okay, sorry, the grammar here is a bit interesting in the spelling. Why word employer pronounced employer in Australia sounding like French? Okay, this one comes from Mo Swaden. So I think you're asking, why does the word employer end with an sound similar to French? In French, I think it would be like employé, like it would be an A kind of sound at the end there, if the word employé was a French word or said in French. In Australia, So the reason we say that is because it ends in an ER. So employer, my name is Peter, bigger, stronger. If you have ER at the end, we pronounce it in Australian English as if it's not followed by another word, right? If it's at the end of a sentence, the ER is pronounced as an kind of sound. But if it's followed by another word, you're going to get the schwa vowel sound instead, with or without the R being pronounced to link that word. So the schwa sound, imagine you said the employer started shouting at me. The employer started shouting at me. The employer started shouting at me. You're not going to hear the employer started shouting at me because it doesn't really go well in spoken English. It's not quick to say. So we use the schwa sound. The employer, the employer, the employer instead of employer. Whereas if there's a word that comes after employer that starts with a vowel sound, we will say the R sound at the end of the word employer in order to link the next word. So Australian English is non-rhotic, meaning we don't always say the R sound. We only say it if there's a vowel that comes after it. In words, between words, whatever the situation is. So employer or employer, if there was a vowel sound after it, would be pronounced as employer. You would say the R sound to link. So for example, the employer is here. The employer is here. The employer's outside. The employer's outside. The employer is. I guess there we're contracting is onto employer. So we're saying employers. The employer's outside and the employer is here to see you. The employer ought to know what to do. The employer is angry. Yeah, so there's sort of three pronunciations depending on the context of any word that ends in ER in Australian English. So hopefully that makes sense. But yes, that's the story. Okay, John M. 1996 asks, are there Africans living in Australia? Yeah, mate, there's plenty of Africans living in Australia from all over Africa. The interesting thing for me is that, and it's not just Africans, but the older I get, the more people from countries like Africa and India, those sort of areas, well, Africa's not a country, it's a continent, but you know what I mean. From continents like Africa and from countries like India and Pakistan, the older I get, the more I see these people further and further out in sort of regional areas of Australia. When I was a young kid, because of the different waves of migration that we've had in Australia, right? So in, post Second World War, we had loads of Italians and Lebanese and Vietnamese and Greek come over to Australia. And then I think in the 90s, it would have been probably a lot more Chinese, more Asian countries. There would have been the odd Indian here and there, and maybe some Sudanese, some African countries, but around the big cities. But the older I get now, the more I see them out in areas like this. So when I was a kid, growing up here in the Bellarine Peninsula, going to high schools and living around Geelong and everything like that, you would see loads of Asian people in Geelong. There would be, maybe one or two Asian people of Asian descent. At school, we often had exchange students from places like Singapore, Japan, China, and that at school as well. So we were used to seeing those people all over the place, but you just didn't see African people in Geelong or in, the Bellarine Peninsula. I just think they're children of the migrants who'd come to Australia from Africa were still living in very specific locations around Melbourne, like in the, the east and western suburbs of Melbourne, at least locally for me. But now you see them all over the place. So, I see them in Ocean Grove, I see them in Curlewis, I take my kid to swimming lessons, and there's, people from Africa, of African descent, there's Indians, there's Chinese people, there's people from everywhere. So it's been interesting how over the last few decades, the more regional areas of Australia are becoming a lot more multicultural. And I think it's just that the children of migrants are moving out here. Obviously, there's the cost of living crisis that's happening in cities, so there's probably also families that are moving out here. There's loads of job opportunities. So it's just been interesting watching those demographics kind of change and adjust over time. But it would have been one of those things, like if I think back to when I was a teenager or something, if we'd had like an African kid come to school, like to primary school or something, I don't think people would have been racist towards him or her, but it would have been that's not common. You would think, oh, wow, an African person, we don't often see them. And the same with, if we had Indian kids or Pakistani kids come to school, I think we were aware of and surrounded by a lot of Asian kids quite often at primary schools and high schools and everything, so it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like unique, it wasn't surprising. But I think thinking back to then in the 90s and even the early 2000s when I was at high school, if you'd had someone from an African country, especially if they were the first generation migrant, like a young kid from there, coming to the school, it would have been very unique. It wouldn't have been, you wouldn't have experienced that before. So, yeah, I don't know. It's just interesting. And I guess it would be like that for all of you guys too, from where you come, in different countries all over the world. There's going to be different ratios of migrants and immigrants and people with different cultures and countries and languages and everything all over the place. So yeah, I wonder what you guys find strange. Like if you're living in Iran, in Tehran, and all of a sudden you had a load of Australian kids just show up at your primary school, are you going to be like, what? That would that be strange? Or would it be something that's not out of the normal because you've got loads of migrants coming from, or migrant students or something coming from other areas around Europe or something. So you would be like, oh, we're used to seeing these people. It's not a big surprise. So yeah, I don't know. It's just one of those things that it's interesting to think about how we may not even realize it, but we kind of get used to being surrounded by the different ethnic groups that we're surrounded by. And then when that changes, especially if it happens all of a sudden, it can just be something you notice and be like, oh, that's, I'd never noticed that before. So yeah. Okay, this one comes from Sapete 1980. Please explain the use of the verb to reckon in Australian English. I still don't get it. Okay, so it can be used in a bunch of different ways, but typically if we say, oh yeah, I reckon, it's our way of saying it's my opinion. I think, I believe, I'm of the opinion that. So yeah, I reckon that's a good idea. I think it's a good idea. I believe it's a good idea. I'm of the opinion that it's a good idea. I reckon that's a good idea. And we just use this a lot. For whatever reason, this would happen in all dialects of English, in all languages around the world. We choose certain words, they become popular, and we just start using them more often than in other places around the world. So like if you go to America and you were to say something like, I reckon, I think a lot of Americans would be like, what are you talking about? They would, even if they understood you, they would probably be somewhat kind of like jolted out of the moment and be like, that's a weird thing to say for someone in America because it's not common for them. They would just say, I think, which you can say in Australia, but I reckon is used quite a lot. I'm trying to think of other ways. So you can say just reckon to mean it's a good idea. So like, do you reckon it's a good idea if we go to the beach? Yeah, reckon, yeah, reckon. Reckon it's a good idea. Yep, reckon. So that's one way of using it. And then we can use it as a phrasal verb like reckon with someone. And that would be, like, well, I'm going to have to reckon with him. It'd be like I have to resolve a problem. There's an issue that we're going to have to resolve. There's going to be a reckoning. I'm going to have to reckon with him. I'm going to have to resolve this problem with this person. There's going to be a reckoning. I'm going to have to reckon with this person. But yes, in Australia, typically we use it for I believe, I think, it's my opinion that, and then whatever the thing is, right? I reckon. Do you think it's going to rain? Yeah, I reckon it's going to rain. So definitely I recommend using it. If you're in Australia in particular, you're going to hear people use this in formal English, informal English. It is probably informal, but it's because it's not rude or, it's not really that informal. You could use this anywhere. You could use this at work. You could use this wherever you want. It's kind of like the word g'day, right? You might not use it if you were in a job interview. Again, it's not the worst thing in the world. No one's really going to be like, oh, I can't hire him. He said g'day at the job interview. But it is that kind of slightly informal Aussie type language. But yeah, I definitely recommend using it if you're in Australia or you just want to sound more Australian. Okay, let's have a look. Skincare by Jackie MTL. More about Australia wild animals. Okay. I'm trying to think of what to really mention. So, what do you want to know, I guess, about wild animals? You've got to give me a question. I'm just riffing. Otherwise, yeah, Australia's full of loads of wild animals. It depends where you are, though. There are certain locations. You don't really see many of them besides, say, things like birds or bugs in cities and suburbia. But anytime you go into the bush, away from, the civilized world, away from cities, away from neighborhoods, suburbia, you typically get to see, some pretty cool wildlife, especially the sort of more conspicuous animals like kangaroos and wombats and emus and koalas, especially along the east coast here of Australia. They're ones you see. But if you want to see the really cool ones, like just weird little things that are not common, bandicoots, the marsupial moles, all those sorts of things, I'd really recommend going to like native animal zoos. And there's a zoo called Hillsville Sanctuary that's a good example of this. I mean, most zoos are going to have native animals, but Hillsville Sanctuary in Victoria, it's out east, right? Well, it's in Hillsville, obviously, but it's out that side of Victoria to the east. They have loads and loads of really cool native animals. So yeah, definitely recommend checking them out. There's just so many cool, weird animals. And the reason we have so many cool and strange animals is that Australia separated from Gondwana, like I think about 80 to 90 million years ago. And ever since then, we've kind of just been isolated and on our own as a continent that's been surrounded by ocean. And the mammals that were here were marsupial, and they all just sort of evolved on their own in this area and didn't really mix with anything else, And the eutherian mammals that we got, the placental mammals that we got, came from Southeast Asia and were things like rats and bats. And I'm trying to think, is that about it? Well, I guess dingoes came over here as well, but that was very recent. That rats and bats came over the closer Australia got to Southeast Asia and started colliding with Indonesia on a continental kind of scale, is when we got a lot of those really interesting eutherian placental mammals coming across. But that's right, why we had such interesting fauna. And I was watching some stuff recently about just before the last ice age, so I think it was as recently as like 50,000 years ago, we had all of our megafauna here too, which should theoretically still be here, right? Like 50,000 years in the real context of things is the blink of an eye. The environment hasn't really changed a great deal since then. I mean, it's adjusted, it's changed slightly, but probably one of the biggest things to happen is, besides, going through an ice age, is humans have also gotten to Australia. They're the other placental mammals that got here and wiped out, contributed to the extinction of a lot of these larger megafaunal animals. An example would be like the thylacine, the Australian wolf or the Australian tiger. We had loads of these. I think there's like 5 or 6 of these species of thylacine that lived across the continent as well as in Tasmania. Tasmania was just the last stronghold. And yeah, they were the equivalent of a wolf, a dog in Australia. They had evolved. They had what would you say? They had, man, it's been a while since I've studied evolution. They'd evolved the same traits as dogs. They could run. They had the same sort of size jaws. If you look at the skulls next to one another, they're different, but at the same time, they're sort of shaped along the same lines. These were carnivores that had co-evolved to sort of do the same things in nature, to chase down prey, to be little predators. And they're just really cool animals. But we also had things like Megalania, which was a 6-meter long, huge goanna. We had crocodiles that could run, actual crocodiles that were large, I think, again, about 6 to 7 meters long. But they held their bodies up off the ground and lived on the land and could chase things down. They were probably here eating humans, right? So Indigenous Australians got here about 60,000 years ago and were interacting with a lot of these animals. We had the short-faced kangaroos. These were huge, 2 or 3 meters high. We had absolutely massive wombats. I've forgotten the name of them, but they were like, the equivalent of rhinos, right? That were that size, roaming around Australia, eating plants and, just being massive. And you can imagine that they would have been a nice target for a hungry tribe of Indigenous Aussies. But that's one of those things that I think as an Australian, the average Australian just doesn't know that much about megafauna and these other native Australian animals that were here so recently. And even just prior to or around the time of colonisation, we had loads more mammals. Australia's gone through one of the worst, or has the worst track record when it comes to mammalian extinctions. I think we have like 100. Is it 100? It's like dozens of mammal species in Australia have gone extinct after colonization, European colonization, only in the last, 250 years, as a result of rats, cats, foxes, rabbits, all these animals that we introduced, livestock, sheep. They've just absolutely changed the environment, outcompeted and eaten loads of these native animals that were here, effectively yesterday. So it's kind of sad. Australia is one of those sad countries where we have lost a lot of our really cool wildlife, but at the same time, we do have a lot of unique and interesting, wildlife. So yeah. All right. Let's keep going. Okay, this one comes from Zaranaz503. If you are in a desert, what is the 5 things that you prefer? Okay, so you mean like what 5 things would I prefer to take? Well, you want shelter, you want water, you want food, and you want communication, right? So that you can get help. So I would say first and foremost, I would want an EPIRB. I think that's what they're called. The device where you can just hit a button and a message gets sent out saying you need help, right? So it uses a GPS system, people can track you down. So I'd want one of those. I'd want shelter, so whether that's a tent and clothing of some kind, I would want a way to stay warm, but a way to also be cool, because deserts in Australia, like probably anywhere, get very hot during the day and cold at night, because there's often very little cloud cover at night time, and all the heat just gets sucked up into the atmosphere and it gets very cold. So, it can get into the minus -1, -2 degrees in the desert sometimes, especially in winter, I imagine. So there's that. I'd want water. You always want enough water to be able to survive for a week or two at a time, I imagine. And then obviously food. Water's more important than food, but there's that. And then besides that, so that's 4 things, probably something to do, right? Whether that's company, someone with you, assuming you've got enough resources for both of you, or something to, like an instrument to play, a book to read, I don't know, a game to play, something like that. I think they're probably the 5 things I would want. But ideally, you wouldn't end up in that situation because you'd be prepared, right? You'd have those things in place and you would know what you're doing and where you're going and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, if you are planning to go into very isolated areas around Australia, just be sure that you've got ways of getting help, as well as having resources like water, shelter, and food with you. And a big thing is if you're in a car and it gets stuck, don't leave the car. That's how people die. They think, I'll just go for a walk and there was a town a few hours back along this road, I'll go get help, it'll be fine. And then they die, right? They overestimate how far it is, how exposed they are, how hot it's going to be, how cold it's going to be. And quite often if help comes, it's going to find the car first, okay? So stay with the car. Stay with the goddamn car. Okay. This one comes from Mona Golami. I might just have a sip first. My voice is starting to go. Let's have a drink. G'day, mate. How old are you? And what was your major in your PhD? Okay. I'm 37. I turned 37 in April. So, yeah, I'm getting old. I'm on the other side of the hill. Going down, huh? And my PhD was in evolutionary biology, evolutionary genetics. So I was using evolutionary genetics and biology to piece together the evolutionary history of native Australian rodents, effectively, a large group of native Australian rodents called the Sodomys species group. It was about, 60 species of Australian rats. And the reason that I was studying rats, besides them being just really cool little animals, these are native rats, ones that have been here for millions of years. Look them up. If you type in native Australian rats or native Australian mice, they are some of the cutest animals you will ever see, especially the hopping mice from the genus Nodomys. If you check these guys out, they are just so cute and cool. And you can even get native mice like, I think it's Nodomys alexis and Nodomys, I'm trying to remember the other species, Mitchellii. You can get them as pets and they're just really cool. They got the most efficient kidneys of any mammal. They can effectively live in the desert without drinking because they get all of their moisture from the food that they eat, and their kidneys are so efficient at pulling the water out of their urine that, yeah, they just rarely ever have to drink. Although, they obviously do if they have water in front of them. But yeah, they're really cool little animals. So the reason I was studying rats is just because they evolve so quickly, right? They speciate. They turn into many different species rapidly. So effectively, 5 million years ago, we had one or two, well, it would have been two or more colonizations of Australia by rodents. They would have come through Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. They got to Australia. They probably came over on land rafts, right? They would have been like, a cyclone or something in Papua New Guinea, and it's only a few hundred kilometers away from the tip of Cape York. A huge amount of debris would have like washed down a river. Rats would have been stuck on it, and then they would have gotten to Australia, washed up on shore or something like that, and boom, breed like rats is an expression. Rats tend to breed like rats. So they got to Australia about 5 million years ago, and they quickly evolved into 75 or so different species. So today, only 5 million years later, it sounds like a long time, but compared to other groups of mammals, it's rapid for a group to have so many different species in such a short period of time. So like rats as a group, I think, have only been around for about 12 million years. And there are over, I think, 1,200 different species of rat. I think Muridae is the family, right? So 1,200 plus different species of rat in the world, all over the world, really. Rodents are all over the place. So yeah, I was just really interested in studying how these guys evolved. When they got to Australia, when they colonized the continent, were they adapted to? They would have had to have been from rainforest environments, right? They've come through Indonesia or Papua New Guinea, which is wet rainforest areas. So they would have been adapted to those kinds of conditions. But then they get to Australia where there are large deserts. There are loads and loads of different types of habitats because it's such a vast continent. And rats today are now found in every single habitat and environment all over the country. There are even rats that swim, right? If you look at hydromes and xeromes, these are two different genera of rats that have adapted to live in the water. They're like Australia's version of an otter, and they eat things like crayfish, and they're just really cool. Hydromes is such a cool little rat, although he's probably Australia's biggest rat. If you go to the St Kilda Pier in Melbourne and you go and see the penguins there, you may see some hydromes swimming around. They live around that area, and they just, you'll see them like little otters swimming around in the water, hunting crabs and fish and all sorts of stuff, and they're just cool as. They got webbed feet. They're just really cool rats. And so I was just really interested in like what happened. So you've got these rats, a population of rats get to Australia, and we've got rainforests, we've got the monsoon tropics, we've got desert in the interior of Australia, we've got mesic zones, right? Forests, different types of forests, open woodland, cold, temperate rainforest. We've got tropical rainforest. We've got, all these different environments that we now have rats in. How did they get into them? Where did they go? Like, did we have rainforest rats just slowly go into the drier environments? They went into different rainforest environments, and then open forest, open woodland, heathland, grassland, and only then they went into the deserts and evolved to get into the deserts? Or were they able to just move from the rainforest to the desert? Could they just make that evolutionary jump to being able to conserve loads of water and eat the food that was in the desert in, effectively the blink of an eye? And the reason it was interesting was because we had, say, a dozen species that live in the desert. We've got a dozen species in the rainforest, a dozen species in the monsoon tropics. Are they all closely related to each respective group? Like, did the rats get to the desert one time and then every single desert rat is closely related to every other desert rat? Or did they get there multiple times from different areas, right? Did you have speciation happen between the rainforests and the deserts, and then between the monsoon tropics and the deserts? Did they evolve to be desert rats, and then some desert rats evolved to go back into the rainforest? There were all these sorts of questions that I was looking to try and answer and figure out. And we did work out that, and I can't remember the specifics, I have to go back and read my PhD. It's been about 7 years now, maybe more than that. I finished when I was about, 30, turned 30. But we worked out, that they had transitioned into these different environments multiple times, back and forth. So they had, originally come and they were adapted to the wet rainforest. They moved into the deserts, into the other forested areas, and then there were species that moved out of the deserts into more forested areas and vice versa. It was relatively random. They were able to do it quickly. It wasn't like if you were from a wet rainforest, you have to only adapt to a slightly wetter rainforest or forested area, right? So yeah, rats were just a really cool group to sort of learn more about how evolution works in Australia. So yeah, there you go. This one comes from Sabira Husseini 195. If you were a kind of animal, which would you prefer to be and why? I guess it depends on what your sort of goals for being an animal would be, right? Like, do you want to try and live forever? You'd probably be a whale or a turtle if you wanted to live for a really long time. Good question. I think something that could fly, right? If I could be like a wedge-tailed eagle, some kind of bird of prey that lives for a long time, maybe a parrot, a cockatoo, man, they live for donkey's years. Cockatoos live for they can live up to 60, 70 years, Quite often if you buy a cockatoo as a pet, a galah or a cockatoo, some kind of parrot, Australian parrot as a pet, especially the big ones, they're going to outlive you, right? If I got a cockatoo as a baby today, it's most likely going to outlive me. I'll die before it does. That's how long they live. It's crazy. So yeah, probably something like that. They're intelligent, they live for a long time, and they can fly. I'd love to experience what the hell was it like being able to just fly around, It's one of those things you watch birds and you're like, they take it for granted. They have no concept of what it is like to not have wings and to be stuck on the ground. Most birds, if not all of them, come to the ground and they walk around and they're kind of like, find some food, fossick around, I'll sit in a tree, I come to the ground to do stuff, but then I can just take off and fly away. If I have a problem, if there's a predator, I'll just fly away. But we obviously can't do that sort of thing. So I think I'd probably want to be some kind of a bird just so I could experience that. Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I think something like that because, you're going to move around a lot. You're going to see a lot of stuff. Whereas if you were, say, a rat living in a forest, you're just going to have a very small area that you live in. You're going to be underground most of the time. You're going to be hiding away under stuff and you're going to be eating, God knows what. Whereas if you're a parrot, at least you're eating fruit and seeds and, pretty tasty things, I imagine, for humans compared to, say, dead animals and rotting trees and all that sort of stuff. Okay, this one comes from No Idea. Thoughts on Melbourne? Well, that's broad. I like Melbourne. I like being able to go there and leave. I think that's probably about the same for any large city in Australia. They're just getting harder and harder to live in because of the cost of living. I think too, if you're from somewhere that's a big city or if you live there for a long time, you kind of get used to it. But the moment you move away and you set up life somewhere else and it's a little quieter, it's a little slower, it's a little more peaceful. It's hard when you go back to a large city for any prolonged period of time because it's just so busy. So, I remember when I was living in North Melbourne doing my PhD at Melbourne Uni, the tram that would come past, you'd hear it all the time. It would be coming past every half an hour. And you'd hear the da-dung, da-dung, da-dung as it crosses, the tram tracks or the crossings and the ding, 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 ding. You would just hear that kind of sound all the time. You would always hear cars driving around. You would have people talking all the time, even outside your house, walking around, just in the streets. It was always just full of people. And that was something that there's something nice about it, but it's also pretty full on. And I think once you move more regionally away from the large cities and you kind of get used to just quiet, it's hard to go back. And a good example is like in Ocean Grove. Whenever I went back to Ocean Grove, where my parents live and where I grew up, you can hear the ocean if there's surf, like if there's a lot of swell and there's large waves, you can hear the ocean from my bedroom. And I don't know if you can do that really I assume you can in places like Sydney. Brisbane, you wouldn't be able to because you're not near the ocean. Melbourne, you wouldn't be able to because you're not near the ocean. But I just enjoyed that sort of... I didn't realise how much I enjoyed that until I sort of left the city, But, I could be picky. But I think, there's pros and cons. The good side about Melbourne and any big city is that there's just stuff everywhere. There's always something to do. There's so many businesses. You could go to a new restaurant or cafe every day and, probably never go to the same place twice over a year. there's just so much there. Whereas as soon as you move away from the cities, obviously you don't have that same density of shops and restaurants and cafes and everything like that. And there's, less in the way of movies and gyms and art galleries and all that sort of stuff, places to go. The public transport isn't as good. So it's a two-edged blade, right? There's the good side and the bad side, but I definitely don't regret moving away from Melbourne. It's just, it's so expensive nowadays too. It's just crazy. All right. Let's keep going. I'll see if I can do a few more. How do you pronounce, this one comes from Rim884Rim. How do you pronounce prove, don't, and celebrate? So there you go. Prove, 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 to prove something, to show something is true, prove. Don't, as in the contraction of do not. Don't. So prove is the oo vowel sound and don't is the o vowel sound. And then celebrate. 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 You're going to celebrate something. Hopefully that helps. Let's keep going. Okay. All right. This one comes from S-1987. That sounds like you're probably my age. 37 years old as well. Okay. What is the difference between girl and daughter and boy and son in speaking? I don't know when to use which. So if you're talking about your daughter or your son, you can use girl and boy and daughter and son kind of interchangeably, right? Like if I've got a daughter, I can say she's my girl, she's my daughter. If I've got a son, I can say he's my son, he's my boy. You can use them like that. I'm trying to think what else is there sort of really that's confusing there. Obviously, if it's a boy or a girl that isn't related to you, you're not going to be using daughter and son, referring to them yourself. They could be someone else. Well, they are someone else's, daughter and son. But typically you can use them interchangeably if you are talking about that relationship, right? Someone's daughter, someone's son. You can use boy and girl interchangeably with that. Is this your boy? Is this your girl? Is this your daughter? Is this your son? This is my boy. This is my girl. This is my daughter. This is my son. It doesn't really matter. People are going to know exactly what you mean. There's nothing wrong with using one or the other. But obviously, if in doubt, use daughter and son. Okay, this one comes from Jaden Souza Nice. Hey Peter, I want to ask you, what do you call fries in Australian English? Okay, so I posted this on Instagram recently and it was sort of a joke about Americans, Brits and Australians and what they call things. Chips in this case. So in Australia we typically call all chips chips, right? So whether they're potato chips, and you'll hear, I'll show you how I kind of differentiate them. Potato chips are those kind of like flat, crispy, hard chips that you would get in a packet from a supermarket, right? They're crunchy. I like salt and vinegar potato chips. We shorten it to chips. If you go to, say, like a fish and chip shop, they're still chips in Australian English, but we would call them, if you wanted to sort of explain more, you would probably say something like hot chips. And they're hot chips that are made of potato. But if you said potato chips, people would think you were talking about the crispy, hard, flat chips that you buy in a packet from a supermarket. Americans call chips for Americans are the crispy, hard ones from the supermarket. Fries would be deep fried, French fries, the hot chips. And in Britain, they call the chips from a supermarket in a packet crisps, because they're obviously crispy. They're crisps. Crisps. There's a good consonant cluster there for you. Crisps. And they call hot chips, I believe. But yes, in Australia, we would just call them all chips. And context, we let context kind of show you which we're referring to, right? Like if I say I'm going to get some chips from the fish and chip shop, you're going to assume I'm getting hot chips. And if I say I'm going to, the supermarket to grab a bag of chips, you're going to assume I'm talking about crisps, about potato chips, right? I'm trying to think, how would I differentiate between the ones you could get from the supermarket that you would put in the oven? I'd probably just say, potato. What would I say? How would I explain that? There'd be a way of doing it, but it would be like chips to put in the oven, baked chips, hot chips. Yeah, fried chips. I would use some other way of explaining it, but typically, yes, we use just chips for everything. Okay. This one comes from Johnny Nguyen 453. Hey Pete, are you back on YouTube? So I've started posting a few of the reels from Instagram on YouTube just to see how they would go, and some of them seem to be doing pretty well. I'm going to try and get back into it. I just have to again kind of think about what I can offer you guys again. So let me know, what would you like to see on YouTube? Maybe I need to put a story on Instagram and ask you what kinds of videos you'd like. This one comes from Raymond Weagle. Why are you so blue-pilled? I'm not sure what that's in regards to. Blue-pilled would usually be someone who's got their head in the sand and isn't awake to whatever it is that I think it's a reference to the Matrix, right? If you take the blue pill, you stay in the Matrix. If you take the red pill, you come out of the Matrix and you kind of get to see what's true, what's real. I'm not sure what that's in reference to. I assume that I said something or I answered something. It can be also a phrase that's kind of like you're a cuck. You're kind of like a slave to your wife. So I'm not sure if you mean it that way. I probably wouldn't consider myself blue-pilled when it comes to my relationship with my wife. I think it's just that I'm an adult and I'm not a chauvinist. So I care about what she wants and everything like that, and I'm compassionate. So I don't know. You'll have to give me a bit more information because I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'm happy for you to explain more. Why? Okay, this one comes from Bald Eagle Edge 777. Why Aussies are into two groups, either take care of their bodies or not at all. Nothing between them. It's an interesting one. I haven't really thought about it. I think we're just similar to every other Western kind of country at the moment where, we have an obesity problem, and I'm kind of in that. I've kind of gotten a lot bigger since becoming a dad, and I used to be ripped. I used to be incredibly strong. I trained at the gym all the time when I was living in Melbourne because it was just, I could walk there. It was around the corner. But it's kind of hard once you become a dad. You're working and you live in suburbia away from, a jiu-jitsu gym or whatever that you used to go to. So I don't know if we're unique to other countries where, either you're ripped or fat. I'd say we're a continuum like anywhere else. But there are definitely Aussies that are fit, but I don't think we're especially unique compared to any other country out there. And I'd say we're probably high up on the obesity index, right? Wherever there are those countries that have the most obese people, I think Australia's probably right up there. And I'm doing my bit to improve that average. All right, let's do one more, and I might finish up. This one comes from G Madzia 92. How drunk can you be and still legally drive a car? Okay, so I would say you're not allowed to legally be drunk at all. And I say that because you can obviously drink alcohol if you're a fully licensed person driving a car and you breathalyze under a blood alcohol content of 0.05. I believe this is Australia-wide as a rule. So you can have alcohol in your blood as a fully licensed driver, but it has to be below 0.05. And I believe that's like if you were, the ads that used to be on it would be like you could have 2 drinks in the first hour and then 1 every hour after that. But I feel like that would just be too much for me. I reckon I'd blow over 0.05 if I had drank that much. So again, the safest thing is to just not drink and drive. But you would not be able to get drunk and drive. I think no matter what your size, if you get to a point where you're drunk, you're not going to be blowing under 0.05. If you get pulled over, you're going to be fucked, right? And there are severe consequences if you get pulled over and you are drink driving and you are over the legal limit. So yes, I don't recommend you do it, not just because you'll get into trouble, but you put other people on the road in danger as well as a result, So if it were me driving around with my kids in the car, I would definitely prefer other drivers had no alcohol in their blood, including the person driving the car. So yes. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed this episode, guys. I will try and answer a bunch of these ones on Instagram itself, so keep an eye out for that. I might end up doubling up. But yeah, it's a pleasure as always. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I will keep them coming. So yeah, cheers. Chat to you next time.